Professor Quartup, I wanted to move to you next. Central to this election is the housing crisis going on in Australia currently. Would you be able to quickly explain what is going on in regard to that to people, for people who don't know? And is limiting migration a credible fix, or do both parties need bolder home building targets to shift affordability? How do you approach both? How do you analyse both parties' approach to tackling this issue?
Well, it's one where you need fundamental reform, and I can't comment particularly on economic policy or housing and things like that. I'm a political scientist, not a real estate expert. But there are two things really that one should look at, and one of them in the campaign, Mr. Dutton was trying to highlight this issue, and then he brings out his son. And of course, he then has to admit that he has to pay for his son. So it's more in the campaign kind of thing. He then, in a way, it was one of several blunders that he made, I think, on forced blunders, where he then suddenly has to say, well, as a relatively rich guy, or as a very rich guy, I will pay for my children. And that's not a thing that really goes down well with the part of the electorate that he is trying to appeal to, which is people in the sort of blue-collar area like Western Sydney, for example. On immigration, I think both parties have tried to be tough. I think there is no indication anywhere in the world that increased immigration lead to higher house prices. We've looked at Canada, we've looked at Germany, we looked at many other places. In fact, immigration directly is correlated with economic growth and also secures pensions. So this idea that, for example, we're suffering from in the university sector, and I'm not really speaking for that sector, where there's a cap on international students, well, that will have a negative effect. That's a Labour proposal, by the way. Will have a negative effect, because if you get students in, then they're often relatively rich and they buy all sorts of things, and that leads to a sort of so-called multiplier effect in the economy. But I think fundamental reform is one of the things that has been needed, and I think in this campaign it's one of a couple of situations where Mr. Dutton kind of missed an open goal and turned it into an own goal.
Yes, Craig Hodges, moving on once again. Have either side's relief packages? We've seen certain relief packages promised by both candidates: cash handouts, tax offsets, fuel excise freezes. Have they truly addressed the structural drivers of inflation, or are they election season band-aids per se?
Yes, I'd have to agree that the policies that we've seen in this 5-week campaign have really only been minor offerings to the electorate. A lot of the macro and structural issues that Australia faces have not been discussed. This is why we're probably relying on, in a minority government, independence, putting pressure on the forthcoming government to look at taxation, to look at structural reform. So Dutton's looking at things like fuel excise, dropping 25 cents a litre. Look, that will help out people that are facing cost of living crisis, probably in the next 12 months. But what happens beyond that? There's not much offering there. Another point I'd like to make is that the demographic change in Australia is such that the two major parties are no longer shoring up the support of voters. There's a shift towards independence. We've seen this with the Greens, we've seen this with One Nation, but in recent election with the Teals, and this trend continues. So the major parties are losing ground, and the heavy policy lifting is being left to the independents. And not only that, I think the two major parties, Thomas, are not in step with the younger demographic. We know that Australia's political debate has been overshadowed in recent weeks by Donald Trump. And I don't think that the parties have been getting their cut through of their message and appealing to the younger demographic, although there has been last-minute attempts to use social influencers, etc., to appeal to the younger voters. But overall, the trend is towards welcoming independent parties, and the Teals are a sign of that. And I think it's up to these new parties and these independents to discuss major structural reform.
I want to bring in that one man that Craig has just mentioned. Obviously, we saw a major impact that he had on Canada's election. Nicola Smith, what kind of impact is the US president, even though he is thousands of miles away, impacting on this election? Is he a central talking point when it comes to voters?
I think he has definitely loomed over the Australian elections. It's not as acute as the situation in Canada, which is bordering America and has some very different issues with the Trump administration and more pertinent issues. In Australia, it's certainly been a shadow over the elections. Halfway through the 5-week campaign, we had at the start of the 5-week campaign, we had the tariff announcement, and although Australia did not suffer as high a tariff, it had a 10% levy against its exports to America. It's still very much stuck in the public consciousness as an issue, and I think this is an issue that has turned out to be more of an advantage for Labour than for the coalition. Labour has really tried to lean into making comparisons between Donald Trump's policies and the coalition's policies. In particular, they have consistently said that Peter Dutton wants to Americanise the health system in Australia. They have pointed to his anti-woke comments, and also one of the coalition's early blunders in the campaign when they talked about abolishing work from home policies for civil servants. That really backfired on them, and that also kind of created a moment where there were parallels made with the Trump administration and with those reforms. And that may well prove to be a factor that loses votes for the coalition. We'll have to wait and see when the results come in. But the Trump factor is definitely has played a role in the Australian elections. I wouldn't say that it was more prominent than cost of living, the cost of living crisis and people's general economic concerns, but it has loomed large in this 5-week campaign.